go ahead and turn things over to Peggy Simonson. Peggy's been a volunteer with Citizens for Conservation for 16 years. She's a former president of CFC and continues to serve on the board of directors. Peggy is currently chair of CFC's Community Education Committee. Peggy?
Thank you, Liz. I also, in addition to Citizens for Conservation, am on the board of the Chicago Living Corridors. And I wanted to give you just a little bit of a background about that before we turn it over to our speaker. The Chicago Living Corridors was founded, Jeff, you can go to the next slide. It was founded a few years ago now with the intent of identifying, go back. There we go. We want to focus on private property. There's a lot of organizations that are working on public property, like the forest preserves and parks and so forth. But most of the property in Illinois is in private ownership. And in our area, most of that is in people's yards. And so our mission and our goal was to map private property that's already been improved with native plantings with quality habitat in the greater Chicago area. And this map is on our website at chicagolivingcorridors.org. And there it's interactive, but the idea is each of these different colors indicates a different organization that helps people identify or plan to improve the habitat in their property. For example, the green are the areas that Citizens for Conservation works. The red is the Conservation Foundation, which is the organization that created the Conservation at Home program, but with similar goals, all of it. And let's go to the next slide, Jeff. There we go. These are the organizations that founded Chicago Living Corridors. Citizens for Conservation, as I mentioned, our program is called Habitat Corridors, and the Wildflower Preservation and Propagation Committee is in McHenry County. Their program is called A Natural Garden in Your Yard. The Conservation at Home program is used by a number of organizations, but started by the Conservation Foundation, and then 2 Wild Ones chapters. These were the organizations that got together to start Chicago Living Corridors, but since then, we've included these additional organizations that are listed here, all of whom do yard visits in order to help people maybe identify what the invasives are, or look at some difficult areas and make recommendations for the kind of natural native plants to put in them. So that's our focus. But we are an umbrella organization. So Chicago Living Corridors itself does not actually do the work, but we're coordinating both with the organizations that do, and as I showed you the map. So you can take a look at the map. And if you are interested in getting your dot on the map, you need to do so through one of these organizations. So you can look at the map, find out which organization works in your area, and then either give them a call or go onto the website. The Chicago Living Corridors website also has a wealth of resources for you to look at. Just all sorts of things on how to get started, or on good plant selections, and lots of videos. The previous videos that were done from these programs that the library has been collaborating with CLC about, we also have those videos on the website. So lots of resources for you there. So next slide, Jeff. What can you do? We are encouraging people to plant native plants, for sure. Join one of these participating organizations in order to get your native garden or your habitat on the map. And we also encourage volunteers with Chicago Living Corridors. We're doing all our programs thanks to the library. We're doing them now by Zoom. We're not trying to do in-person programs, but we still have behind the scenes work if anybody's interested in helping us out. And you can contact us on the website, and just get on the website and see, get a bigger background and picture of who we are and what we do. So now I am very pleased to be able to introduce Jeff Weiss, our speaker tonight. He has designed and helped to implement more than 50 green infrastructure projects with many community partners. Many of these projects focus on habitat corridors, including streams and rights of way. Jeff is also the currently coordinator of the Flint Creek and Spring Creek Watersheds Partnership in the Greater Barrington area. And those are examples of green infrastructure projects where it's not one homeowner that owns it, but the Flint Creek runs through a number of properties. And so the coordination of those is an appropriate thing. Jeff will provide examples, lessons learned, and funding sources for green infrastructure opportunities that can be employed maybe on private property, but also on homeowner association common areas. So in addition to the Flint Creek and Spring Creek watersheds, Jeff founded and leads the Buffalo Creek Clean Water Partnership in Buffalo Grove, which was named Lake County Stormwater Management Commission's Stewardship of the Year in 2016. He's president of Living Lands Conservation Company, which provides environmental consulting and on-the-ground ecological restoration service. So we're going to hear from Jeff today on the whole business of ABCs of green infrastructure. So Jeff.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Peggy. And I want to thank and welcome everybody who's joined tonight. And this is a topic that I dearly love and I can talk for hours. So to kind of head me off at the pass, I urge you to put your questions in the chat, and that will give Liz the opportunity to pick a question every now and then that we can stop and get into a discussion and drill down a little bit and maybe slow me down from just droning on. So I really appreciate your being here, but please participate with me. And I want to just react to a couple of the things Peggy mentioned in her remarks about Chicago Living Corridors. I went to some of the very early meetings of the group, including one at Millennium Park several years ago. So I've kind of watched this organization develop, and it's doing great work. Another organization that I was involved in very early on in my conversion from corporate guy to nature guy was Citizens for Conservation. And so my wife and I started a group in Buffalo Grove called the Buffalo Grove Environmental Action Team, but it was definitely inspired by Citizens for Conservation in Barrington. Also, when I started the Buffalo Creek Clean Water Partnership, I talked with Meredith Tucker, who was the coordinator of the Flint Creek Watershed Group. So that was also inspiring. So now that I've taken a job with the Flint Creek Spring Creek Watersheds Partnership, which is sponsored by Citizens for Conservation, I kind of feel like I've gone back to the mothership, and hopefully we'll be able to contribute in return for some of the many things that I've learned and gained from my association with those two organizations over the years. But my talk tonight is about ABCs of green infrastructure, and I suppose that almost everyone on this call, perhaps other than a few family members who I noticed are present, two of my daughters and my aunt and uncle, just they're giving me positive vibrations. But I'm going to imagine the rest of you are fairly knowledgeable about green infrastructure, but maybe are reluctant to get started and own a project, or would like some helpful pointers about things to do in your own yard, or maybe even get more involved in Citizens for Conservation or our watershed group. So I'm trying to accomplish many things, and that's another reason to slow me down and make this worth your while by asking your questions. So I'm going to come back to this slide, but this is part of my green infrastructure experience. It's the park across the street. It's named after my wife, Martha Weiss. How do you get a park named after you? Well, when this park sign was first put up, a lot of people would approach me and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry about Martha." And I say, "Oh, no, she's fine." So I think people have a belief that you can't get a park named after you while I'm alive or while you're alive. But my wife belies that idea. And this is definitely our grandkids' favorite park. But to kind of review the idea of living corridors, we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics on green infrastructure. But one of the central concepts and really the founding idea of the Chicago Living Quarters organization is that we've got some splendid natural areas around the Chicago area. Some of them are very large, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them further down the line. But it is really, really important for genetic material to move back and forth between these large areas called core areas. And that's where this idea of corridors comes in. So plants can spread their pollen and their pollinators, and animals can move back and forth to meet their needs for food, shelter, and all of their other needs. By moving between these natural areas, these corridors are critical. So they can be large or small, they can be piecemeal or they can be continuous. But in the village of Buffalo Grove, and I'm going to give some case study material in a little bit, we've established a green infrastructure network connecting these places. And the village has started a campaign calling these areas that we are restoring and developing as green infrastructure and maintaining, they're calling them village gems. So I'm really proud of the work that we're doing in Buffalo Grove. And one of the key things about our work in Buffalo Grove is that these are smaller sites. So unlike some of the large areas that Citizens for Conservation and other groups are protecting and restoring and maintaining, these are small areas. These are all, with a couple of exceptions, these are all under 10 acres. And there are many of these opportunities that are important areas for green infrastructure, and they add to the total inventory of areas that are habitat and can provide a sanctuary for some of these natural resources. So the things I'm going to talk about tonight are some examples of things that are not green infrastructure. I will give some examples of projects, large and small, and then come back to this idea of the green infrastructure network that we're building in Buffalo Grove and how you can get involved in your own community to help build these types of programs. And then I'm going to bring it back one more time, back to the living corridors idea. So that's our agenda for this evening. And this picture, you'll see it again, but the heart of green infrastructure, at least the way I practice it, is using these native plants with these deep root systems. They help infiltrate stormwater. They store carbon. They help these plants make it through drought. They provide underground habitat for uncounted tiny microorganisms and provide a range of other benefits. So while these plants are delightful above ground and they have a range of colors and forms and pollinators and everything else, a lot of the action is going on underground. And that is one of the reasons why we use these native plants. Another purpose of showing this picture is to make the comparison with that plant in the middle called Kentucky bluegrass. And I will get back to that plant, but you can see that the inch-deep root systems are not comparable in any way with these native plants. And so with that, I'd like to just jump into some examples of not green infrastructure. This is kind of a classic golf course picture, but you've seen this in other places. Where the turf grass, the mowed turf grass right to the edge of a pond or a stream is slumping and breaking off and causing erosion and sediment to get into the water. This is not green infrastructure. Here's another case. This is an eroded stream bank, and this is fairly typical of urban streams where the steep stream banks are continuously eroding and causing trees to topple into the creek and creating debris jams and other issues. Not green infrastructure. And this is our one of our nemesis plants, European buckthorn. This plant has so many bad qualities. I'm not going to enumerate them, but one of the latest is that it turns out that all parts of this plant can't contain a toxin that is lethal to, especially to amphibians. So in addition to sterilizing the ground and changing the soil chemistry wherever buckthorn infests an area, it is also toxic to some of our most rare and beneficial wildlife. And here's another one with some of the same bad habits as buckthorn. This is Oriental honeysuckle. And this plant is the first thing to leaf out in spring and the last thing to lose its leaves in fall. And so it completely shades out the canopy in the forest or anywhere it takes over. And the ground underneath it is totally sterile and definitely not green infrastructure. Here's some more common plants that are used in landscape horticulture, and they all escape into our natural areas and cause a lot of harm. Doug Ptolemy, who is a common speaker, categorizes plants into 3 varieties. Plants that add to the food web, plants that are neutral to the food web, and plants that are detrimental to the food web. By that he means plants that are capable of supporting the insects, pollinators, and especially the caterpillars that all of our bird species and some other animals need to support them. And these 3 are examples of plants that take energy out of the native ecosystems and do not provide any habitat value for these beneficial organisms that we all depend on, not green infrastructure. And here's a couple of other common invasive plants. This is a wonderful stand of garlic mustard. I was pulling garlic mustard all afternoon today, trying to eliminate the last of it in one of our parks. And a common teasel, which has become a really, really common sight along all of our roadways and edges, and these plants basically inhibit and prevent our native plants from flourishing, not green infrastructure. And finally, I call this group the unholy trinity: reed canary grass, Phragmites, and narrowleaf cattail. These are the common plants of our wetlands. They are very invasive. They exclude other plants. They do not support wildlife populations. And I'm working locally, and Citizens for Conservation is leading the charge in taking steps to replace these bad plants, these bully plants, with beneficial plants, particularly sedges, native sedges that they call warrior sedges. So I have some more on that in a few slides. Now we're coming to the home landscape, and back to the subject of this of these perfect bluegrass lawns. They're also bluegrass lawns are also suburban deserts. And of course, they require lots of inputs in the form of fertilizers and pesticides. And if you want to keep them green all summer in our climate, you have to water them all the time. All of those are resources that could go to more worthy causes. So again, back to Doug Ptolemy, he urges shrinking down the turf grass areas of our home landscapes and using these native plants for the many benefits that they will provide, including reducing these fossil fuel inputs, water resources, and the lack of benefit for any other living things provided in these perfect lawns we seem to love. And finally, the last non-green infrastructure is this industry that seems to have popped up of going out and spraying mosquitoes in people's backyards. Not only is it not effective, the only effective treatment for mosquitoes is larvicides, because they move around, and just because you kill them off in your yard, they'll just come in from adjoining properties. But the pesticides that they use are not effective against mosquitoes, but they are extremely effective in killing every other kind of insect that might be on your property. And this is my lame attempt at photoshopping what happens when a monarch comes across a yard that's recently been sprayed by Mosquito Joe. And that is not green infrastructure. So having given you several ideas of things that are not green infrastructure, here's a list of the types of projects that I've been associated with. And again, these beneficial and wonderful plants that we use for these types of projects. So I teach ecological restoration at Morton Arboretum and retired from College Lake County and Oakton Community College. So I love restoring prairies, woodlands, and wetlands. There's many large projects going on in our forest preserves and in our some of the preserve owned by the various land trusts that are doing this work. But also there's a lot of other smaller projects and local projects that can be effectively done. I'll go through some examples of all of these, so I'm not going to read off the list to you. But before I do, I want to just kind of go through some of the benefits of this work, because it is beneficial and valuable. So definitely green infrastructure is about purifying and making water and soil more healthy and more resilient and more sustainable. And especially with water, that means both surface water and water that's getting into the ground, and people, at least in the outlying suburbs, are depending on for their water supply. Reduced flood and erosion. And I love just biodiversity, the idea of biodiversity by itself, all these plants and animals living in healthy communities, and especially pollinators and insects, birds, all of their populations are crashing across the country. And so this is our work to try to help them survive and help these populations recover. And then I believe these plants and animals are nice to look at and infinitely interesting. We can create low maintenance landscape and reduce or avoid entirely some of these inputs and fossil fuels that are contributing to climate change. And then public events, education, engagement, partnerships, and I'm going to get to the economic benefits in a second. But first, I want to call out some of the local groups that I've been working with in some of the projects that I'm going to describe in a few moments. The Park District and the Village have been the main sponsors and landowners for the projects we've been working on. But we have our environmental action team, Boy Scouts, high school kids, corporate sponsor, Siemens Company. The Rotary Club just did a couple of planting projects with us over the weekend. And the Buffalo Grove Garden Club, it's always great to have them come out and get their expert help in supervising planting projects. So I love working with all these groups, and it's part of what keeps me active and involved. But as to the economic value, this was recently published study by Lake County Forest Preserve District related to the annual dollar value of land acquisition and volunteer hours. So when we do land management and ecological restoration, we get significant dollar benefits in terms of this water purification, erosion and flood control, and storage of carbon, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it underground or in the tissues of plants. And the estimate is that just preserved, any open preserved land is going to be worth at least $5,000 an acre. But if it is restored using green infrastructure principles and practices to a level of environmental and ecological integrity, that value jumps up 5 times to $25,000 an acre. And if it's high quality habitat and restored land, it goes up again to $35,000 an acre. And so that is not including the enhanced property values of the surrounding properties and the homes that have trees on them. I heard the National Forest Service estimate today that just having a mature urban tree canopy increases housing and property values by a minimum of 10%. And then there's all the recreation and other values for people in having nice public lands and private protected lands. So I'm just going to run through a quick list of green infrastructure projects, large and small. I'm going to start out with the largest one I've been really actively involved in, and that is Deer Grove Forest Preserve. I've been so involved in that, I even got a little wetland that the volunteers named Weiss Wetland. So I'm very proud of that. But this area was restored by a combination of Open Lands, and Stantec was their contractor, and then the Deer Grove Natural Area volunteers. I think there's a couple on this Zoom call. And they started out with this core area of 135 acres in the middle of this preserve. And all of these green areas are wetlands that were restored. But then in the past 12 years now, the volunteers have been expanding and expanding beyond these yellow borders. And the results of their work are truly impressive. And every weekend, there's work going on at Deer Grove Forest Preserve. Kudos to them, and kudos to all the people who volunteer and work in our preserves and natural areas. This one was funded by when O'Hare runways were expanded. They had to mitigate the wetlands that were destroyed in the expansion. So half of that money went to Deer Grove Forest Preserve, is over $2 million. But the resources have been stewarded very, very carefully, and the work that's been done has been very, very successful and very impressive. So I urge you to come out, and if you haven't seen this at Deer Grove East, please do. Another project very near and dear to me is Buffalo Grove Prairie. Buffalo Grove Prairie is a 10-acre site under ComEd lines, next tucked in between an industrial park and some train tracks. But you walk inside and it's remnant prairie, never been plowed. So you see the most splendid, beautiful plants in a setting that you would never see in a recreation or a prairie restoration. So this is the legacy that we have from 10,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. And this prairie has been worked on by the Prairie Guardians for now 35 years. And I've been steward at Buffalo. I've been honored and privileged to be steward at Buffalo Grove Prairie for the past 4 years. And it's one of my favorite places to visit, particularly this time of year. And then this one I was involved in. This was a Village of Buffalo Grove project, his first village project I'm going to talk about. But this is a stream bank restoration. Buffalo Creek comes out of Buffalo Creek Forest Preserve at Arlington Heights Road and flows through the Buffalo Grove Golf Course. But before it gets there, there's this little area called the Buffalo Creek Nature Preserve. And this was one of those streams with those high slumping stream banks. And the village went ahead and applied for a grant under the Clean Water Act, Section 319 program. I think they got $170,000. And then they had to match that with their own cost and labor. But that resulted in this over 1,000 feet of stream being very, very nicely restored. Groups came along, including Siemens and the Rotary Club, and donated trees. And we've had many volunteer events to help restore the vegetation in this area. But this is a case of some pretty heavy lifting where I believe it was 70 trucks full of material were trucked out of here to reduce the slope of these stream banks and allow vegetation to take over and protect them from further erosion. It's quite a successful project, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished here. And then another one, I applied for a grant for this one. This is a case where Buffalo Creek was diverted around a new subdivision back in the early 90s, or maybe the 80s, before there were stormwater ordinances. And it's been fighting to get back into its old channel ever since. So this is a case of green infrastructure involving hard armoring. In order to protect the trail that provides access to this park, we needed to install these bags of boulders because it was just tearing up this land, working its way toward the trail that was the only way to access the park. So we got a grant from Lake County Stormwater Management Commission, Watershed Assistant Grant, and we did this hard armoring because it was not feasible to do a gentle project using native plants. However, we have, since this was completed, installed plantings along and into these bags of boulders called gabions, and the area is starting to take on a more natural look. Those are, and this one is a permeable paver project. We got an OSLAD grant, another granting agency. I think the grant amount was just under $80,000 to install a very long driveway with these permeable pavers. And one of the features of these pavers is they have pipes underneath them to allow the water to drain away and to be able to clean them out and keep the pavers so that they don't get clogged up. But anyway, those pipes have pipe covers coming out into the grassy areas along the driveway. And we've established very nice native planting beds to hide those covers and to protect them from getting run over by mowers. So that this one is kind of a double green infrastructure, reducing the amount of stormwater runoff getting into the stream, and also providing an opportunity for us to install 7 native planting beds along the sides of this parking lot. So what I've talked about so far are all big, expensive projects that are probably way beyond the individual reach of most of the participants in this call. So I want to just turn my attention now and talk to you about the projects that you can do at home in the smallest scale. My home is Conservation at Home certified. Open Lands is the certifying agency in our area. And I have 2 shady rain gardens that I'm proud of because it's not always easy to get wet native plants established in shade. But these plants are thriving. You can see the wild geraniums in flower. This was taken yesterday. Irises. There's some foxglove beard tongue or penstemon. I love my little violets. And in all, I've got about 70 different species of plants growing in my yard. Most of them are in this shady area. And then my little pride and joy is this now 12-foot white oak tree. I bought it, I didn't buy it, I got it as a free tree. It was a whip. It was about a foot tall and thinner than a pencil when I put it in. And this tree has just taken off in this site. And white oak, of course, is our state tree. And it's got a happy home, hopefully for 100 years or more to come. Now, Peggy, I think in her introduction mentioned plant sales, and plant sales are a great place to stock up on these native plants. CFC, Citizen for Conservation, is over now for the year. They had another record sale this year, and I think virtually all of the native plant sales set records. So this green infrastructure at home idea, I think, is taking off. CFC also has a program where you can bring home seedlings of some of the rare or unusual native plants and plant them in your yard. The deal is you take them home and plant them. You have to harvest the seeds and return them to CFC for their seed program. But that is another way to get involved and engaged in this idea of green infrastructure and using these native plants. So that's the kind of at-home angle, and there's a lot more things you can do at home. So I will pause and see, are there any questions at this point, Liz, that people might want to take up?
I don't see any questions that are popping up, although I did have a couple of people who chimed in with some projects that they are working on. So Donna said that she is starting the restoration of Still Farm in Bull Valley, and they're now working on restoring the roadway habitat, which is really great. And then Peggy actually mentioned that there's a group in Barrington that's trying to eradicate teasel along the roadsides, which is really cool.
Yeah. So Peggy lives on the other side of Deer Grove. Well, actually, I think it's Deer Grove East, but she lives very, very close to where the woods starts at Deer Grove. And so I've done some project work very close to Peggy's yard. And one of the invasive plants there is Tree of Heaven, which is kind of a problem. But yeah, lots of opportunities. In Bull Creek, I want to react to that. McHenry County is very, very involved in a project called Hackmatech. It's our closest wildlife, excuse me, I forget the designation of Hackmatech National Wilderness, not wilderness area, but it is got a national designation, and many stakeholders and projects are happening out at Hackmatech. And it's very, very exciting. So
Cool.
Thank you, Bull Valley, for what you're doing with that.
I do have a couple of questions that just came in since we're pausing. Are there techniques or considerations that you have made when working adjacent to bean or corn cropland?
Corn cropland. Wow. I don't have any firsthand experience other than my wife and I own farmland up in Wisconsin, and we have a wildflower garden there next to a crop that's in, or next to a field that's in corn and soybean rotation and alfalfa rotation. But no, I don't. That's an interesting question. I don't have any advice on that, except to say that having a field in a corn crop is a very good way to hold off invasive plants until the land is ready for restoration. So in other words, a lot of times in forest preserves, when they acquire new land, they will continue to rent the land to farmers to put into row crops with minimal inputs of fertilizer and pesticides, of course. But that will be a good way to start out with a blank slate for a prairie restoration project, rather than letting it go fallow and develop some of these invasive plants.
Gotcha. Let's see. Mark is wondering how effective permeable pavers are at reducing water runoff. Is that a thing you know about?
I don't have any statistics for you, Mark, but I believe it's very effective. Just from personal observation, I spent a lot of time at the parking lot. This is near our pool where I work with volunteers to maintain those 7 native plant gardens. And I can't say I've stood out there and watched during a thunderstorm, but I believe that those pavers do keep significant amount of water out of the stream.
Great. Can you suggest plants that are good to plant along the roadway?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that is such a great question. So plants along the road, and I've got a slide coming up on that. So let's just hold that thought because I have some comments about planting along roads.
Okay.
But thank you for that question, and I'll get to that in a few slides.
Okay. Why don't you continue on, and then we will tackle some more questions at the end.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Liz. Thanks for the questions. So back to Martha Weiss Park. This is my grandkids' favorite park. It was a little neighborhood park. My wife retired after 22 years on the board of the park district. And so they named this little neighborhood park after her. And this is so close, I can't resist spending a lot of my time there. We have a sunny pollinator garden. It's about 15 feet wide by 20 feet long. This isn't a very flattering picture of it, but we also have directly behind the sign, I think that's an old picture. Well, there was a tree directly behind the sign, a giant Norway maple that died. And so we converted that into a shady pollinator garden. And that thing has really, really come on very nicely in the past 3 years. So these are examples that the park district said, I approached the park district and told them what I wanted to do. And they said, sure, go for it. And not only that, they delivered large loads of mulch from the Water Reclamation District. It's a product called, it's a biosolids product called EQ compost, extra quality, I guess, exceptional quality. But that stuff makes for wonderful, wonderful media for raised beds and for establishing native plantings. And the two best parts about it are it's free and they deliver it free. So contact if you're in Cook County, contact the Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago and get some of this EQ compost material. It's dynamite. Another place where we use that same material is at Green Lake Park. This is one of our large community parks near our home. And last year I teamed up with the Rotary Club, Garden Club, the Environmental Action Team, and this year with Lions Club. We got grants from Lake County Stormwater Management and the ComEd Green Region grant, $7,000 grant from ComEd. We've had 90 volunteers come out for a spring planting event and a fall planting event, 50 in the spring, 40 in the fall. And we did 3 Eagle Scout service projects, all at Green Lake Park, all in 2021. Among other things, we established a native tree and shrub arboretum in this park. So the arboretum, we started it in spring and fall last year. We did all the plantings, purchased 50 different species of native plants from 3 different native shrubs from 3 different nurseries and some trees, not many trees. And we planted them to start the nursery. We also planted under those cottonwood trees that you might have seen. We planted woodland plants, and then in the swale, in the sunny swale, we planted some wetland plants right at the bottom of the swale and prairie plants going up to the side to establish a nice native planting area. So you can kind of see that planting going on. 50 volunteers spread between these areas. It was just a delightful time, and the plantings have taken off and been very, very successful despite the drought last year. So it was fairly modest expense. And this year we're continuing to put in trees. The Lions Club, as I said, purchased additional trees. We're installing signs and tags so that people can learn about these plants and incorporate them into their home landscapes. Maybe take out some honeysuckles and put in some of these native shrubs instead. So just to give you a feel, there is a big grassy area at this park that was nothing but turf grass. And the inset is a photo of one of these planting beds. I took this picture yesterday, and the Iowa crabs in the middle had just finished blooming. I should have been out there last week. But there's 5 different species of shrubs in this bed, and there's 6 or 7 other beds, some sunny, some shady, some dry, some wet, sprinkled across this park. And when we put up the tags, they will have a QR code on each tag so that visitors to the Arboretum can look up these plants. The QR code goes to the Illinois Wildflowers database, which gives a lot of information about these plants and how to use them in the home landscape setting. So here's just a quick list of the large shrubs and the small shrubs that we established in this Arboretum, and tried to pay particular attention to the pollinator and host plant associations with these shrubs and trees. So it's all very nice and good to provide pollinators with nectaring opportunities, but they also need places to lay their eggs where those caterpillars can get forage and complete their life cycle. So in addition to being pollinator plants, these are also host plants for these insects. And that was another objective of this Arboretum, was to establish forage opportunities for these herbivorous insects. So now this was our first project in Buffalo Grove. This goes back about 15 years now. Well, maybe not quite that long, because the Environmental Action Team has only been around 13 years. So this is one of the first things we did with the Environmental Action Team, was approach Siemens Corporation. They're our largest employer in Buffalo Grove. This is our Metra Station, and they have a lot of employees, and they have buses, shuttles that they send to the station to pick up their employees. So I thought, well, shoot, all of these Siemens employees are visiting the train station. Let's give them something nice to look at when they walk out of the station and see this retention pond. And so Siemens forked over money for seeds and for seedlings, and they sent a bunch of their employees out to help plant and install plugs at the site, and it's turned out pretty nice. So we've taken these pond shorelines out of goldenrod and reed canary grass and put them into a nice variety of native plants. And then there's this other little stretch along the ramp where commuters walked on their way to the parking lot. And I was out here this morning, and we've established a little sliver of native planting beds. This one is from last year ago, and it's not very colorful, but we have been installing more plants and enriching this little area. So these green infrastructure projects can pop up in all kinds of different places, and you can get your organization involved and publicize your organization, put a little sign in there, create interest in native plants, and get some kudos for your organization, limited only by your imagination and the energy you're willing to put into it. So ever since I started with the slide in my yard, all of these are projects that are done fairly easily and without any engineering, without any consulting services, without any legal permits required. So these projects are really very doable. And depending on the scale you want to take on, I'm happy to talk to anyone about any of these projects, opportunities, anytime. This is another project we did with Siemens. Again, they contributed money for the plantings, and they sent their employees out on a Friday morning to help us plant. They gave them lunch, and they got to go home early. You can't beat a deal like that. So this one is a dry basin. This was just a mowed turf dry basin. Rarely collects any water, but it's right next to Buffalo Creek, and it's also right next to our village hall, which is across the basin. So the first year we put in I don't know, a few hundred plugs of different plants. They've done very well. but this is about a fifth of an acre basin. So it was far more than we had budget to put in plugs. So what did we do? Well, we put in a mix, a seed mix, but very wisely, we included a lot of black-eyed Susan seeds and a lot of Canada wild rye seeds in our mix. And by 4th of July that first year, people were walking by this basin on their way to 4th of July fireworks and just saying ooh and ah. And they weren't talking about the fireworks. They were talking about all the black-eyed Susans blooming here. It was spectacular. And black-eyed Susans and Canada wild rye, they're early species. They kind of go away and other things take over. But in I think this has been 7 or 8 years we've had this. Every year it's been something different that's flushed and just produced beautiful, beautiful blooms. So it's a continuing source of beauty and wonder, and it's never the same 2 years in a row. So, and it gives our village a little opportunity to spread the message about green infrastructure using their this sign. Farrington Corridor. So now I'm going to talk about a corridor project. We have in our community 3 community parks lined up. So the Green Lake Park, where I showed you the Arboretum, is on the north end. We have our largest community park, Mike Rilko Park, just south of that, and just across Highway 83, McHenry Road. We have this little corridor that's owned by the village, and it's you can see, perhaps if you look sharp in the middle, you can see Farrington Ditch running through it. But this area we funded with a ComEd Green Region grant, $10,000. And that money allowed us to purchase oak. We purchased, I don't know, I'm going to say 40 or 50 decent sized oak trees. Mostly bur oaks to plant in the wooded area after we took out the buckthorn and honeysuckle. We have a deep basin where we've taken out the Phragmites and the cattails and have established warrior sedges and bur reeds and what's the other plant we've got in there? Yeah, one I'm not so sure of, river bulrush. It seems to be fairly aggressive. But that area looks great. We've really knocked off those unholy trinity plants that were in there, and this lower basin along the creek is kind of a floodplain, and it is just flourishing. It was mostly all teasel and bird's foot trefoil a few years ago. Those are some of the invasive plants, but they are under control, and native plants are truly flourishing in this area. And so this connects up to another park, Willow Stream Park, where we've been doing some restoration work, and that connects up to our golf course and then Buffalo Creek. So what we've got really is a mile-long corridor of habitats. We're doing some project work along and hope to get into the golf course. It virtually connects up 2 of the watersheds, the Aptekissick Creek and the Buffalo Creek, that run east and west through our community. So this is a really, I believe, a great example of using this idea of habitat corridors. Now we have a lot of turf grass in our community, and last year we got a grant from the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation, which has been a real big benefactor for other projects that Citizens for Conservation is working on. But in our case, they gave us $10,000. We killed the grass in a grassy basin and in this large expanse of turf. We avoided the expense of hiring guys to mow it 20 times a summer, and have established 6 acres of native plants to provide all of the benefits I've been talking about. And we got another grant, this one for $20,000 to do similar work at 3 different sites in the Buffalo Grove Park District. So very, very excited. These are pretty easy projects. The first step is to knock out the turf grass. Second step is to scatter seeds in the proper type of seed mixes in the correct seed densities. And the third step is to watch them grow. Not sure whether they're going to need to mow them this year, but when they come along after a few years, we will start including them in our burn program, which I'm going to talk about in a few slides. So this is an example of a project that was virtually free to our landowner public agency and accomplished in, I'm going to say, less than 30 hours of labor, including my volunteer time. Now, finally, we get to talk about plants along roadways. And I have seen many, many failed roadway projects where along highways and in medians that were put into prairie plants. They get invaded. And the biggest problem in my experience with roadways are when salt gets applied in the winter and the salt gets slushy, cars roll through and they kick up the salt spray. And salt spray is very toxic to most plants. That's one of the reasons why Phragmites and cattails and reed canary grass are so successful, is they are very salt tolerant. But in this particular median, it's very narrow, and we use the same type of mix that we put into our basins. So it was a mix that was heavy with Canada wild rye and black-eyed Susans, but there's also probably 20 or 25 other common prairie species put in here. And this picture I took late last fall, but it was extraordinary how diverse this was and how many different species I saw. So can I identify them all from here? No, I cannot, but I can see that there's still Canada wild rye in the foreground. There were some daisy fleabanes and some weedy things, but there were also some very nice asters. And my recollection is there are about 20 different species growing in this median that's about 2 feet wide. Now, the only maintenance that we've done on it is going through with a brush cutter, like a weed whacker, and trimming down the height of these plants to about 2 feet in June or early July. And that helps prevent them from reaching their full height, and also prevents them from getting too leggy and flopping over the edge of the median. So pruning these plants in early and mid-summer, I think, is a good practice. It tames them down, it keeps their heights down, and they flower much more fully than they suffer much less floppiness than they would if they were not pruned. So I don't know whether I've gotten to all the dimensions of the question about roadway plants, but they can succeed. But salt is really, really a big issue with these plants, and they are very prone, roadway plantings are very prone to being invaded by things like teasel, Phragmites, reed canary grass, and things that are more salt tolerant. So I don't know, maybe the questioner has a more specific question on that. Anything, Liz? You're on mute.
I'm not seeing anything for that one.
Okay. Anything else you want to bring up?
I do have a handful of questions that have come in the last couple of minutes, if you'd like to field those. Otherwise, we can hang on to them till the end.
Yeah, sure. Let's
All
let's
right.
uh, let's
So I have
get
someone
people
here
in the
who
conversation.
says, sure, there is a piece of land next to the inlet of Highland Lake that is supposedly consisting of dumped fill. We don't know where to start to make this into a healthy habitat for native plants. Do you have any suggestions?
Dumped fill could be anything, and soil matters. Soil is these native plants are not fussy, but they each have kind of their own preferences. So without knowing more about the contents of this dumped soil, and I really can't give you any advice on it. Be more guided by how much sunlight it gets and how well it drains. And then depending on those two factors, put in a mix with a seed mix with as many different species as you can that meet those criteria, and let the soil and the seeds select for each other.
Okay. William's wondering why more swaths of power lines aren't places for native plant corridors. Do you know if there's a reason for that?
Yeah, we're working those in Buffalo Grove. But one reason why they're not used more is that they have been, over the years, poorly maintained underneath. So they are large refuges of degraded habitat, depending on whether it's wet or dry underneath. They've filled up with brush or Phragmites, reed canary grass, and cattails, or teasel, depending on whether they're wet or dry or sun or shade. So that's one of the, and that's a lot of work to undo the harm after an area's become invaded and degraded. But I can tell you that ComEd is trying. They have a program and they have a contractor that is taking care of a lot of these rights of way. And if you have a particular area that you would like to try to work on, let me know and I can connect you to my contact at ComEd. They would probably do an evaluation, get to know you, and decide whether your site was something that they would be willing to spend some resources to fix up.
Sure. Mark is wondering if you purchase your mixes or you make them with collected seeds.
I'm coming to that. Thank
Okay.
you for the question. I'm coming to that in a couple of slides.
And then Jackson wonders what the technique is that you used for knocking out the turf grass.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's glyphosate. Glyphosate, and near the end of the growing season, I've become a big convert to fall planting, fall work. So we broadcast Roundup or aquatic approved Roundup, depending on how wet the area is, to knock out the grass. We leave the thatch because that provides a good seed bed, but we knock out the grass, leave it for a couple of weeks, and then try to plant into it before the first frost. So as the winter season progresses, the freeze thaw cycles open up the soil and let the seeds in and stratifies them, and the thatch from the grass keeps them from washing away if it gets wet. And by spring, we're getting a nice seed response.
Makes sense. And then how do you permanently remove, you've said this like 5 times and I keep forgetting how to say it, the Phragmites?
Phragmites, yeah.
That's what it is, yeah.
How do you permanently remove it? Well,
Yes.
That's a great question. Some combination of spraying and burning and spraying again and spraying again. Again, this is, I hate the idea of using environmental poisons to improve the environment, but to me, it's kind of a binary thing. Either you want to do the right herbicide in the right concentration at the right time to maximize its impact and to reduce the and try to eliminate as much collateral damage as you can. But the only way to get rid of it practically is either going through the bulldozer and scraping it out, or herbiciding. Since bulldozers can't get into most of these wet areas, herbicide applications are the only things that work. But sometimes in combination with mowing, and if you can burn your area, those are the three tools for getting rid of Phragmites. The main tool for keeping Phragmites out is to establish competitive plants. And those are a relatively small number of sedges called the warrior sedges. So Citizens for Conservation has a lot of information about that. And a number of other plants such as iris, blue flag iris. Depending on how wet, there's a number of other semi-wet or emergent plants that can be used to establish a thick ground cover that will inhibit return of those invasive wetland plants.
Makes sense. And then Donna's wondering if spot spraying or hand painting is a good way to take care of a smaller area.
Yes, very definitely. Spot spraying or hand wicking. I've done many hundreds of hours of individual rubbing herbicide over the stems of these plants is a good way to prevent damage to the beneficial and conservative plants that might be growing near them. But for large degraded areas where there's nothing but those invasive plants, that's where I'm suggesting broadcast spraying.
Got it. That's all the questions that we have here. So if you want to go ahead.
I have some other slides, but I'm past my hour. So
you are good. Yep, go for it.
So here's some of the programs that we've put together locally in Buffalo Grove, and all the conservation organizations use these programs, but we have a burn team made up of the village and the park district. I was the burn manager. Illinois requires a certified person to be in charge and be present. I was that person, but now we've got people from both the village and the park district who are getting their certification. But prescribed burning is one of the very best tools for maintaining these areas once they've been reestablished in native plants. All of our native plants have been adapted and evolved over the past 10,000 years to withstand fire and actually to benefit from periodic fire. So this is a really valuable tool, and it's a little complicated because we don't want it to get away and cause wildfire, but learn more about burning. It's good. And then another program that we've got, oops, going too fast. We have a nursery set up in one of our water treatment, behind the fence in one of our water treatment plants. And we grow about 300 or 400 of these sedges every year for planting out into our natural areas. I start them on my patio, and then I stick them in these gallon landscaping cans. We float them in the water. We keep this is a rubber cover around this bed. We keep them wet all summer, and by August and September, we got these nice chubby plants with root systems, and they're already sprouting new plants for next year. And we stick those out into these natural areas that we're working on, the wet areas. And then finally, I'm going to get the answer to the seed question. We do have a volunteer seed collecting, cleaning program. Last year, we collected more than 80 different species of native plants and totaled more than 100 pounds. We get together, the Boy Scouts and other community members come together for this seed cleaning event. And then we take all of the seeds, 100 pounds of seeds that we've got, we split them into mixes for prairies, woodlands, and wetlands. And then, because even 100 pounds of seeds is a lot of seeds, but it probably isn't going to cover more than about 10 acres. And we're working on probably 30 or 40 acres of new areas at the moment. We need a lot more seeds. So we've gone out to reputable seed companies and purchased various mixes. Some of the companies that we've used is Prairie Moon Nursery, and then there's Agricol and Genesis Nursery. Those are three of the nurseries that we've established relationships with. But we take the locally collected seeds from our volunteers, we mix them up with the purchased seeds, and then those new mixes are the ones that go out into our restoration projects. And I think it's conservative, but I estimate that we save the park district and the village about $10,000 to $15,000 a year for the seeds that we give them versus purchasing that amount of seeds. So I have a series of slides about the Green Infrastructure Network in Buffalo Grove. I am going to skip that for tonight. And I'm going to get on with the conclusion and see whether there's any other questions or discussion. Maybe I'll stop here. One thing that we do is that we maintain these areas, and we like to measure how they're doing. And so one way of measuring is to assess the number of species and the number of native species, and how conservative they are, how likely you are to find them in a healthy habitat. And there's a calculation called Floristic Quality Index that allows you to generate a number that you can compare over time, look for improvement over time, and you can compare with other places. So this is a comparison between the Buffalo Grove Prairie, which is the native remnant prairie that I've been a steward at for many years, with one of our degraded Phragmites marshes. So the difference in scores between a 63 and a 3.7 is just one illustration of how far some of these degraded areas have to go to be healthy. All right, so just to wrap this up, some of the things that I think we've learned working together over the years is that communications with neighbors and community involvement are critically important. We've discovered and accessed a wide variety of funding sources and labor sources to get this work done. Some kinds of green infrastructure are easy and cheap, like converting turf to prairie. That's pretty easy and cheap. Reclaiming degraded areas under power lines, Phragmites marshes, buckthorn forests. That's difficult, expensive, and takes years and years to accomplish. So, it helps to choose your openings and not waste your time on things that are just not going to be possible without extreme amounts of work and expense. I think one of the lessons of starting with that little village hall basin was starting small and gaining confidence. That one was a winner, and it really won over a lot of fans to the idea of green infrastructure. And then don't start projects, start small, but don't even start small projects without a plan to maintain them over time, because they will require maintenance and some invasive control over time. Tasks can be structured and scheduled for flexible use of staff time and volunteer time, and they can be done all around the year. So brush removal is great time for that in fall and winter and spring. Seed collecting in summer, especially late summer and fall. Planting plugs in spring and fall. You can do this work year round. And then the last thing is results take time and persistence, sometimes an infinite amount of time and almost an infinite amount of persistence. Just keep cutting, burning, and planting, and good things will happen. So that's what I got for you tonight. Here's a little blurb for my watershed group. We have 2 watersheds, Flint Creek and Spring Creek. They're wonderful areas. Visit our website, Flint Creek, Spring Creek Watersheds.org. We have watershed plans. We're working on updating the Spring Creek plan at the moment. It is a wonderful, wonderful watershed. It starts down here in Hoffman Estates. Actually, the stream flows north through Barrington Hills, a little bit of East Dundee, and ends up in the Fox River at Fox River Grove. We collect and study water samples, but one of the wonderful things about this Spring Creek watershed, all this green area, is Spring Creek Forest Preserve. It is a massive preserve of 4,000 acres. The Forest Preserves recently bought another added piece called Horizon Farm. So it's nearly 5,000 acres of really, really nice habitat. So this is a major core area. And now with our watershed plan, we're trying to build connections to other core areas and corridors to help with all of these goals that I mentioned earlier. The key group involved in that is the Barrington Greenway Initiative, sponsored again by Citizens for Conservation. This is a group picture of the Spring Creek Stewards. It's one of the groups collaborating with Citizens for Conservation. Learn more about the Barrington Greenway Initiative. They're doing amazing things. And then, don't forget Liz's event. It sounds spectacular.
We hope
Saturday.
so. It'll be fun.
And here, I don't know if Peggy wants to chime in again, but here is my contact information and some information about the Living Corridors organization. And Peggy, I'm not hearing from you, so I'm just going to go to your last slide, which is the next program on the schedule for CLC.